Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to kick off the second day of the INTERSCT conference. As Harold already mentioned, I want to talk to you about what we can do about insecure IoT right now, as well as in the short and medium term. Some of the parts of the project focus on long-term solutions, which is in the end what we're going to need, like security by design. But we will be stuck with mopping up insecure devices and compromised devices for at least the next couple of years. So that is the problem I'm going to tackle today. Some of you may have seen some of this material at the One conference, and I'm happy to tell you there is some additional new content that I'm going to share with you today. So while our poor consumer here is being inundated with new devices, we know that once people start connecting these, a certain portion of these devices are going to get hacked. If you're wondering what Roodkapje is doing in the bottom right corner, it's actually my poor attempt to draw an evil hacker. I couldn't figure out how to draw a hoodie on a stick figure, so my apologies. We know hackers are taking over a certain portion of our connected devices. And we have pretty good visibility into how they're doing that because we, and together with partners across the world, are running honeypot networks that actually see what the attackers are up to. From these kind of vantage points, we can see very clearly that the majority, over 80, in fact, often even over 90% of all the compromised IoT resides in ISP broadband networks. And that has a very clear implication. It means the consumers are bearing the brunt of this problem. They own the devices that are getting hacked. So what can consumers conceivably do about this? Well, we give them all kinds of advice. Here's a random webpage from a security provider telling people to change names and passwords and to check if certain services could be disabled. But in all fairness, even among this audience, if I would hand you an IP camera and tell you to disable Telnet, I'm pretty sure a majority of you would not be able to figure out how to do that. So this is not actionable, usable advice we're giving to end users. So people have thought, well, maybe we should warn people beforehand when they're in the market to buy devices and tell them when sometimes these devices are not so secure. So in fact, you see now quite a few projects looking at IoT security labels. So a security label is basically a very simple way to express to a consumer how secure a device is. So let's say I have drawn a very crude example here, that you are in the shop, you're looking at a box of an IP camera, and the box tells you it has 3 stars out of 5 in terms of security. Now what? What are you supposed to do with that information? Is that enough? It's certainly more than 1 star or 0 stars. It's not 5 stars. Are we expecting consumers to draw the conclusion that they shouldn't buy this device now because it has only 3 stars? Or are we expecting them to think 3 stars, that sounds decent, I'm going to get that? So it's totally unclear if you inform people that there are security risks, what you expect consumers to do. And I think it's really implicitly what we're doing here is dumping responsibility on consumers. It's basically a security model that I would call "we told you so" security. So let's say you buy this thing with 3 stars, it gets hacked, and then of course the technical expert is going to say, but I told you this device was not secure. It only had 3 stars. Why didn't you take this information? But none of this is actually clear, right? Nobody is in the shop buying a new car, looking at safety ratings of cars and then thinking, oh, it has 3 stars out of 5. I shouldn't buy this car. That makes no sense. If the car is really insecure and unsafe, it's not allowed to be sold. So this idea that we push this responsibility to evaluate security to the consumer, to me, makes very little sense. And in fact, I think a lot of what we call user awareness is actually victim blaming. We are shifting the responsibility to the entity that is the least in the position to actually manage these risks. And that is in the end the one victimized. Now, let's say for a second we go along with this whole user awareness stuff, and people do in fact want to do the right thing. At that point, they're going to look for guidance on how to make their device more secure. So let me share an example of what consumers will then run into. And I feel compelled to tell you beforehand, this clip is real. It's not satire. It's an actual instruction video produced by General Electric last year to tell you, as a consumer, how to factory reset your smart light bulb. I'm going to play this clip, not in its entirety, because it will take too long, but just to give you a flavor what happens when we turn this problem over to consumers.
Welcome to C by GE's Smart Tips. We're going to show you how to factory reset your C by GE bulbs, which will unpair your bulb from other devices and apps that it's connected to. There are two factory reset processes, which depend on the generation of bulbs and the firmware you're running on. Here's the first process, designed for bulbs with this package, or for firmware version 2.8 or later. Start with your bulb off for at least 5 seconds. Then turn on the bulb for 8 seconds. Turn off for 2 seconds. Turn on for 8 seconds. Turn off for 2 seconds. Turn on for 8 seconds. Turn off for 2 seconds. Turn on for 8 seconds. Turn off for 2 seconds. Turn on for 8 seconds. Turn off for 2 seconds, and then turn it on one last time. The bulb will flash on and off 3 times to show that the reset was successful. If it doesn't, your bulb may be running on an older version of firmware and will need to try the second factory reset process, which is designed for...
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. You can see already this was painful enough and that this was one of the 2 reset processes. This is what we actually tell consumers to do. And think about it. It could be worse because most devices have no instruction videos. Plus, General Electric is actually a well-established brand with a reputation to lose, with over $100 billion revenue per year and 280,000 employees. So, you know, the odds of them doing basic IoT security properly are better than average. This is the situation that we get to once we think that we have to explain to consumers how to make their devices secure. It's madness. Well, sometimes then I get the counter question, but you know, why do people want to buy this stuff in the first place? Shouldn't they be more critical and not just, you know, run after every gadget that has something, some of these features? But the point is, you know, so the underlying point here is nobody's forcing people to buy this crap, right? Well, I don't think this is true. This is not something where people sort of voluntarily seek this out. To some extent, sure, but this is a wider societal trend. Just this morning, I looked at Coolblue. If you want to buy a new television, if you can actually buy one that is not connected to the internet. And the answer is, yeah, but barely. And not for very long is my prediction. If we do this event again next year, I'm pretty sure the number for smart TVs, TVs without smart components is going to be 0. So this is not just consumers being frivolous. This is a wider societal trend where manufacturers push devices to become more connected. So all of this stuff that we're talking about here is solving stuff end of pipe, as environmental scientists call this. Excuse me. We're solving it when the problem has already occurred. And of course, it makes much more sense to fix the incentives for security upstream of the value chain. And there are some long-term and some short-term fixes there. So let's take a look at what we can do once we move up the value chain. So once we get to manufacturers, the first thing, of course, that has already been observed quite a lot is the incentives for manufacturers to introduce security into their devices are weak at best. And the reason for this is if they don't do it, nothing happens. The consequences of all these compromised devices are borne by other stakeholders, not by the manufacturers. So how can we fix this? Well, the long-term solutions are relatively clear. We need binding requirements, and devices then need to be certified against those requirements. And we need liability. If you introduce devices that cause damage, you should be the one paying for it. But these solutions will take quite a long time, I think at least a decade, before they will be in full force. So what can we do in the short term? Well, there's two things that sort of approximate these long-term solutions. First is, absent of liability, we can still get some accountability by making transparent which manufacturers are actually causing this problem. The second short-term fix is, absent of certification, is we can soft regulate the existing mechanisms of self-certification. This is this famous CE logo that was also mentioned yesterday, which technically speaking is not certification, by the way, but I will save that discussion for another day. So we already see examples where this has happened. For example, this is a list that Brian Krebs, who was one of the first targets of the Mirai botnet, published together with some security researchers. These devices were the compromised devices that were in the Mirai botnet that attacked him. So there are some brands there that probably most of you never heard of. And remarkably, when he published this, one of those brands felt compelled to say that they were going to issue a product recall. Now, this is now a few years ago. It's quite unclear if this product recall actually happened or they just hoped everybody forgot about it. But the fact that they felt compelled to say that they were going to do a product recall because somebody made visible that their devices were part of the problem, that to me is actually quite hopeful. It means this transparency potentially has some legs. The soft regulation approach, we've also seen some examples. One example here is, for example, that ASIS is under a 20-year audit requirement from the American Federal Trade Commission for basically not updating their routers. So the FTC asked them a few times nicely if they would perhaps patch the known vulnerabilities in the devices, and they couldn't be bothered to do that. And then the FTC said, well, if that's the way you're going to do it, then we're going to pull out some regulatory options. And in the Netherlands, we're slowly moving in this direction. This is from Agentschap Telecom, the radio telecommunications agency, who actually recently also did an audit of a bunch of IoT devices. And I hope this is actually a first step towards a more enforced type of certification. So there are actually some things we can do already to improve the incentives for manufacturers. Now, between manufacturers and the consumers are also, of course, retailers. What can we do here? Well, there is already a very well-established legal norm. It's called product conformity. If the product doesn't meet reasonable expectations of the consumer, then you are entitled to take it back to the store. Now, the fact that your device gets hacked and the manufacturer refuses to patch it, I would argue, falls perfectly within the product conformity doctrine. You have a reasonable expectation that the manufacturer will issue security updates, at least for a certain period. And we don't need everybody to take it back. We just need a small percentage of active consumers, security-aware consumers, to return this, because product returns are very costly for retailers. These companies work under small margins. If you get 5% of these devices, probably even 1% of these devices returned, that margin is destroyed. And then what will happen is the retailer will become more selective when they buy from certain manufacturers, because those manufacturers might actually, in the end, generate more cost for them than profit. But of course, even if we all do all of these things, the consumer will still be left with insecure devices, which will be hacked. So what can we do here? Well, sorry, let me. Here we have one other stakeholder in between the consumer and the criminal, and that is the ISP. And the ISP is actually a control point. It's basically the gateway for, as we saw earlier in the presentation, 80–90% of these devices onto the wider internet. So what can we do here? Well, we can ask ISPs to stop and clean up, stop these devices and clean them up. But how would they do this? And is this even realistic? Let's first think about the how. Let's say you're the ISP, you have seen certain customers as being infected, for example, because you get a notification from an entity like Shadow Server, which is running IoT honeypots. And then you have to send a message. And the message goes something like this. Hi, we are the ISP. There is some device in your home that is infected and it's very dangerous. We don't know what device it is or what type even. And we also don't know what you can do about it, but here's a few things you can try. Maybe there's a firmware update. Maybe you can change some passwords. Good luck. And this, you might think this is a little bit facetious, but this is basically the advice that ISPs are currently sending to consumers. It's a little bit, it tries to be a little bit more helpful, but the basic boundary here is the ISP doesn't know what device it is. Sometimes we can tell with some fingerprinting what it might be, but most of the cases we don't know. So the ISP is stuck with giving very generic security advice. So does this even work? Is it at all useful if you tell people something that is so not actionable? So a few years ago, we did a study with KPN, and in fact, found through a randomized controlled trial, which is sort of the gold standard in empirical research, that yes, customers, ISP customers are able to clean up infected IoT, even when you give them quite unpractical advice. So that's quite remarkable. In fact, 92% of these devices were cleaned up in 2 weeks. That still left us with the question, what do people actually do when you give them these very generic cleanup steps? So there is a follow-up study we did last year, again with KPN, again, a randomized controlled trial. And here we found that almost nobody does all the steps you tell them to do. People sort of cherry pick the steps, the 5 steps that KPN recommends. Some do only 1, some do 2 or 3. They also basically do them in a random order, we found out. Consumers are in that sense quite, let's say, picky on what they think is meaningful to do. But remarkably enough, even though they don't fully follow the advice, cleanup rates are actually quite high. And the people who comply more with the cleanup advice are only marginally more likely to be cleaned, about 30% more likely to be cleaned. So the fact that people cherry pick this and don't fully follow the advice turns out it's not that critical, which, if you want to do the glass half empty version of that, means the advice is not very good, right? We're telling people to do things that they probably don't have to do. So conclusions. How can we clean up the current Internet of Evil things that we already have? We can do some things upstream. We can monitor, name and shame vendors. We are currently actually working with the Ministry of Economic Affairs to do exactly this. We've identified, off the top of my head, 9 vendors which have most of the compromised devices in the Netherlands. And the ministry is planning to actually engage with these manufacturers and ask them what they're going to do to solve the problem that they've created. I think we can also leverage product conformity, so make bad security more costly through recalls. And we're going to ask, or already have asked, ISPs to quarantine and remediate the infected IoT. And on the side of the government, there's actually already a lot of instruments that they have. sometimes people have this impression that we need new regulation, we need IoT regulation. I don't think any of that is true. I think we already have quite a well-established legal framework to act on this, but we haven't actually done it yet. So look at this CE marking, for example. All the crap that comes into the market also has the CE marking, which basically means the vendor claims to meet all prevailing EU regulation. I am pretty sure if you look into it that they don't. So the problem is not that we don't have rules, the problem is that we don't enforce the rules that we have. The take-home messages, there's actually already quite a lot of instruments that we can use in the current situation to make to clean up and stem the tide of insecure devices coming into our markets. Thank you very much.
Michel, thank you very much. And I see from our chat window that there are a number of interesting questions. And I think the first one we'll start with is the one from Robert, who basically asks, why should consumer IoT devices be secured as they are very often in a consumer LAN setting? Could you comment on that?
Yes. Interesting question. Well, a lot of these devices are actually publicly reachable through the internet. So we also, at some point, were stumped by the idea that if these devices are behind a router, they're behind a firewall, so how are criminals actually reaching these devices? There is no full answer to this question yet, but there are a couple of mechanisms that we know are at play. Some devices open up ports. There is a protocol to talk to your router to get it to open ports for the device. Those ports can then also be used for outsiders to reach that device. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism is some people have, for whatever reason, turned off the firewall settings. And the third mechanism is once you have one infection in the local LAN, that device, there are certain variants of malware where that device actually starts attacking devices in the local environment also. So this is why just putting them behind a router is not good enough, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. One more question that kind of pops up is about, let's say, who or what is the balance between the consumer responsibilities and the producer's responsibilities?
Yeah.
Could you comment on that?
Well, sure. I mean, I think from the presentation, it's pretty clear that I feel the responsibility on the side of consumers is very limited. I think it's wrong that we are going to let consumers evaluate security of devices, even if it is through very simple labels. I think this makes no sense whatsoever. If you feel a device is insecure, you shouldn't be allowing it to be sold on the Dutch market. You know, the factory default setting, credentials, zero patching, these things should not be decisions that consumers are going to have to evaluate. These should be things where consumers can expect that the stuff that's being sold here works, meets minimal requirements. We're not going to the shop, buy something, and then going to look at the fire hazard rating. You know, what is the odds that if I plug this in at home, it's going to set my house on fire? Nobody would think that's a reasonable thing that you as a consumer have to evaluate. No, you're buying a device, electric device, and then you have the reasonable expectation that this thing will not catch fire. And I think it's the same on the side of security.
That also Robert came up with is, can we trust the internet for business-to-business IoT, so industrial IoT, I guess, applications, or should we migrate to more isolated intranets of things?
Interesting point. I mean, I think in practice, segmenting networks is a standard part of every security strategy, security policy. So some form of isolation, I think, is what we already use. But the idea that we're going to separate these devices from the internet, I think, is a battle we've already lost. I'm not sure it's a battle we should want to win, by the way. I think there's huge benefits associated with this too. So I'm not against it, but definitely the idea that we can basically air gap IoT from the internet makes no sense, right? Even in a business setting. Look at the situation in hospitals, for example. You could argue lots of medical devices don't get patched, so we have to air gap them because they're clearly very vulnerable. But if you air gap them, basically the whole logistical process that a hospital also has to run no longer functions, right? If you have your MRI safely in a separate network, but you cannot get the results from the MRI into the electronic patient record, then nobody can move forward. So the idea to isolate them completely, I think, is not a viable strategy.